I am Elizabeth Harris. In the kitchen, bathed in the morning sunlight, I was carefully brewing coffee. Outside the window, I could see the Johnsons, our neighbors, heading out for their morning jog, a peaceful, familiar scene. "George, breakfast is ready," I called to my husband, and I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. We've been married for 40 years and live in the suburbs of Willow Grove, Pennsylvania. Life in this town is picture perfect. Our spacious yard has a rose garden I tenderly care for, and we often host barbecue parties for the neighbors on weekends. "Beth, breakfast is delicious as always," George said with a smile. His warm words never fail to make me feel happy. After breakfast, I head to the community center for volunteer work. I lead a reading club for seniors, and today we're discussing F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. On my way home after the activities, I stopped by the supermarket. While selecting ingredients for dinner, I thought about our son, David. He lives in Philadelphia with his wife, Sarah, and their 6-year-old son, Timmy. I was a bit worried that we hadn't been in touch much lately. When I got home, I found George relaxing in the living room. "Beth, have you heard anything from David?" he asked. I shook my head and replied, "No, not yet. It's been over a month since we last spoke." A flicker of concern crossed George's face, but he quickly returned to his usual calm expression. "I see. They must be busy," he said, but there was a slight tension in his voice. While preparing dinner, I thought about David and Sarah. They had always been a loving couple, but during our last video call with Timmy, something seemed off. Sarah had dark circles under her eyes, and David looked thinner than before. "I wonder if something's wrong," I muttered while chopping vegetables. "Did you say something, Beth?" George poked his head into the kitchen. "Oh, it's nothing," I answered, but inside, my worries were growing. After dinner, we watched TV as usual. The news reported on the worsening opioid crisis. "It's such a terrible problem," I said, and George nodded silently. Before bed, I tried calling David again, but there was no answer. I left a short message on the voicemail and hung up. Lying in bed, I decided to visit David's house tomorrow. If there was a problem, I wanted to be there for them as family. With that thought, I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. I had planned to visit David's house with yesterday's resolution in mind. However, fate had a completely different turn of events in store for me. As I was heading to the kitchen to start breakfast, the doorbell rang. Looking at the clock, it wasn't even 7 a.m. yet. Who could it be at this hour? I wondered as I walked to the door. The moment I opened the door, I gasped at the sight before me. There stood my 6-year-old grandson, Timmy, covered in blood from head to toe. "Grandma!" Timmy called out in a hoarse voice. "Please help me with my wounds." For a moment, I couldn't comprehend the reality in front of me. Timmy's appearance was so shocking that my mind went blank. But seeing my grandson's pitiful state snapped me back to reality, and I immediately sprang into action. "Timmy! It's okay," Grandma will take care of you properly." I scooped Timmy into my arms and carried him to the sofa in the living room. His body was surprisingly light and trembling. The smell of blood stung my nose, making my heart ache. "George, come down quickly. Timmy is hurt." Hearing my cry, George came rushing down the stairs. His face was a mix of surprise and confusion. "What on earth happened?" George asked, his voice shaking. As I was about to check Timmy's wounds, he spoke in a small voice. "Grandma, look at these pictures." With trembling hands, he took out a smartphone from his pocket. The screen displayed numerous photos, but I couldn't immediately understand what they showed. "George, take a look at this. I'm going to get the first aid kit." As I said that and stood up, I noticed George's demeanor change drastically. He stared at the smartphone screen, his whole body shaking violently. "George, what's wrong?" Feeling uneasy about his reaction, I hurried to get the first aid kit. When I returned from the kitchen, George was pale as a ghost, as if his soul had left his body. "Beth, this is..." he stammered, unable to meet my eyes. As I began tending to Timmy's wounds, I peered at the smartphone screen again. What I saw there was unbelievable. David, Sarah, and George. The photos showed them in unnatural poses, as if trying to hide something. "George, what does this mean?" George couldn't answer my question. He just kept trembling, his eyes closed and face turned away. At that moment, Timmy began to speak in a small voice. "Dad and Mom. Grandpa." His words were fragmented and difficult to understand fully, but a terrible premonition ran through my heart. Something awful might be happening within our family. "Timmy, it's okay. You're safe now," I gently embraced him. "No one will hurt you anymore. Can you tell me slowly what happened?" Timmy, sobbing, began to speak bit by bit. As I listened to his story, I felt a crushing pain in my chest. Family secrets, betrayal, and terrifying truths were gradually coming to light. All the while, George remained silent, continuing to tremble. Seeing his state, I began to suspect that he too was deeply involved in all these events. "George, you know something about this, don't you?" At my question, he finally looked up. His eyes were filled with regret and fear. "Beth, I..." Just as he was about to speak, the doorbell rang again. We all jumped at the sound. Who could it be? And what will become of our family from now on? I took a deep breath and stood up. Whatever truth awaits us, we must face it as a family. "George," I said with a serious expression, "what's about to happen won't be easy. But we need to face this problem as a family." George slowly nodded. "I know. Beth, I'm so sorry. I'll tell you everything honestly. For Timmy's sake, and to rebuild our family." I took a deep breath, preparing to answer the phone. A difficult road lies ahead of us. But by revealing the truth and making the right choices, we should be able to overcome this crisis. Holding Timmy's small hand tightly, I answered the phone. "David, we need to talk. Come over right away." After hanging up, a heavy silence fell over the living room. We were all tense about the confrontation with our family that was about to begin. However, for Timmy's future and for the healing of all of us, this ordeal cannot be avoided. Outside the window, the light of a new day was shining in. I sincerely hoped that this light would illuminate our dark past and show us the path to new hope. After hanging up the phone with David, a heavy silence fell over the room. Timmy had fallen asleep, exhausted, while George stared out the window with vacant eyes. I headed to the kitchen to make some tea, hoping to calm myself a little before the difficult conversation ahead. When I returned to the living room with the tea, George began to speak in a small voice. "Beth, I'm truly sorry. I've ruined everything." His words stirred up various emotions within me. Anger, sadness, and deep disappointment. In our 40 years of marriage, I had never felt so disconnected from my husband. "Why did you keep quiet?" I asked quietly but firmly. "We're married, aren't we? We promised to overcome anything together." George let out a deep sigh. I was ashamed. I felt like a failure as a father for not being able to protect our son. His words sent a pang through my heart. George had always tried to be the perfect father. Because his own father had been strict and poor at expressing affection, George had always strived to protect and support our children. "But George," I said gently, keeping it a secret only made the situation worse. He nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I know. But I thought everything would go back to normal once David found a job. I never imagined they would turn to drugs." I tried to understand my husband's anguish. He must have acted with good intentions. But the result had created this tragic situation. "What should we do?" I asked, almost to myself. "Should we report this to the police? But if we do, David and Sarah will be arrested. What will happen to Timmy?" I couldn't answer this question myself. My heart was torn between wanting to protect my family and my duty as a law-abiding citizen. George spoke quietly. "You're right, Beth. We need to do the right thing. But I don't know what that is anymore." Just then, Timmy called out in a small voice, "Grandma, I'm hungry." I came back to my senses and headed to the kitchen. As I prepared breakfast, various thoughts raced through my mind. Timmy's future, the possibility of David and Sarah's recovery, and the fate of our entire family. While eating breakfast, I asked George, "What do you want to do?" After a long silence, George slowly opened his mouth. "To be honest, Beth, I'm scared. But we can't run away anymore. For Timmy's sake, for David and Sarah's sake, we need to make the right choice." His words gave me a little comfort. At least we were facing the same direction. "You're right," I nodded. "But what is the right choice? The police? Or..." Just then, the doorbell rang. David had arrived. We looked at each other and took a deep breath. The conversation we were about to have would determine the future of our family. Holding Timmy's hand and walking towards the door with George, I prayed silently. May we overcome this ordeal, may our family find happiness again. And above all, may Timmy grow up in a safe and loving environment. As I was about to open the door, my resolve solidified. No matter how difficult the road ahead may be, we will face the truth and make the right choices. That's the only way to save our family. When I opened the door, David and Sarah were standing there. Their faces were heavy with fatigue and anxiety. David's eyes were red, and Sarah seemed to be trembling. "Mom, Dad." David choked on his words. "Timmy." "Come inside," I said, trying to maintain my composure. "Timmy is safe. We have a lot to talk about." As they entered the living room and saw Timmy, David and Sarah's faces showed relief. But that relief was short-lived as tension filled the room. "Sit down," George said in a low voice. "It's time we talked about everything." We sat in a circle. Timmy pressed his small body close to me, and I embraced him protectively as I began to speak. "David, Sarah, we understand your situation. But why didn't you confide in us?" David covered his face with his hands. "I was ashamed. I didn't want to be seen as a failure." "It's not just about the money, is it?" I said quietly but sternly. "We know about the drugs too." At these words, David and Sarah looked shocked. Sarah began to cry, and David couldn't lift his face. "Did Dad tell you?" David asked in a small voice. "Here," George spoke up. "No, son. Timmy, he recorded everything." David and Sarah were stunned. They couldn't look at their son, their faces showing shame and regret. "Why, Dad?" David suddenly raised his voice. "Why didn't you report us to the police? You could have stopped us." George let out a deep sigh. "I wanted to protect you. I wanted to protect my grandchild, our family. But in the end, we couldn't protect anyone," I said sadly. A heavy silence fell over the room. It was broken by little Timmy's voice. "Dad, Mom, please don't do scary things anymore." At these words, David and Sarah broke down crying. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Timmy," Sarah said in a trembling voice. "Mommy and Daddy did wrong things. We won't do it ever again." David also apologized tearfully and tried to approach Timmy, but Timmy clung to me. "It will take time to rebuild trust," I said quietly. "But this can be a new beginning. If we all work together, we can overcome this." George nodded. "You're right, Beth. I made mistakes. But it's not too late. Let's do the right thing." I took George's hand. Seeing the determination in his eyes gave me a little reassurance. "First, you two need to go to a rehabilitation facility," I said to David and Sarah. "During that time, George and I will take care of Timmy here." David and Sarah hesitated but nodded. And I continued, We'll talk honestly with the police. No more hiding." At these words, the room seemed to freeze. But no one objected. Everyone understood that this was the right path. "As a family, let's overcome this ordeal," I concluded. "It won't be easy, but with love and honesty, I'm sure we can get through this." At that moment, I felt as if a small ray of hope had entered the room. It will be a long journey, but I sincerely hope that today would mark the beginning of a new chapter for our family. 6 months have passed since then. David and Sarah have been participating in a rigorous rehabilitation program, taking it one day at a time on their road to recovery. They were charged with drug possession, but the court gave them a chance for rehabilitation and handed down a suspended sentence. They are seriously committed to their mandatory community service and regular drug testing. George was also charged as an accomplice, but considering his age, he was sentenced to community service. He volunteers in local drug abuse prevention programs, sharing his experiences with young people. George and I were granted temporary custody of Timmy by the court. Timmy is slowly regaining his smile and has started making friends at school. On weekends, he's now allowed visits with David and Sarah. In family therapy sessions, we've shed tears and vented anger, but gradually, understanding and forgiveness have begun to sprout. Timmy can now tell his parents, "I'm not scared anymore," and hope shines in David and Sarah's eyes. Through this ordeal, I feel our family bonds have grown stronger than before. By facing the truth and making the right choices, we were able to make a new beginning. There will still be challenges ahead, but I believe that with love and honesty, we can overcome